Hey, it's Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books. Today we're continuing the plot to seize the White House by Jules Archer. This is Part 1, Chapter 4. Butler detected an odor of intrigue. Some kind of outlandish scheme, he was convinced, was afoot. Knowing little about the gold standard, why Roosevelt had taken the country off it, or who stood to gain by its restoration and why, he began thumbing through the financial pages of newspapers and magazines, sections of the press he had never had any occasion to read. The first important fact he learned was that government no longer had to back up every paper dollar with a dollar's worth of gold. This meant that the Roosevelt administration could increase the supply of paper money to keep its pledge of making jobs for the unemployed and give loans to farmers and homeowners whose property was threatened by foreclosure. Banks would be paid back in cheapened paper dollars for the gold-backed dollars they had lent. Conservative financiers were horrified. They viewed a currency not solidly backed by gold as inflationary, undermining both private and business fortunes and leading to national bankruptcy. Roosevelt was damned as a socialist or communist out to destroy private enterprise by sapping the gold backing of wealth in order to subsidize the poor. Butler began to understand that some wealthy Americans might be eager to use the American Legion as an instrument to pressure the Roosevelt administration into restoring the gold standard. But who was behind McGuire? A short while after McGuire's second visit, he returned to see Butler again, this time alone. McGuire asked how he was coming along in rounding up veterans to take with him to the convention. Butler replied evasively that he had been too busy to do anything about it. He then made it clear that he could have no further interest in the plan unless McGuire was willing to be candid and disclose the sources of the funds that were behind it. After some hesitation, McGuire revealed that they had been provided by 9 backers, the biggest contributor putting up $9,000. Pressed to explain their motives, McGuire insisted that they were simply concerned about helping veterans get their bonus and a square deal. People who could afford such contributions, Butler reflected ironically, were hardly the type who favored a $2 billion bonus for veterans. When he prodded McGuire further, the fat veteran revealed that one of his chief backers was a wealthy legionnaire he worked for, Colonel Grayson M.P. Murphy, who operated a brokerage firm at 52 Broadway in New York City. Butler pointed out the contradiction between McGuire's claim that his group was concerned with the problems of the poor rank-and-file veteran and that his backers were all obviously wealthy men. McGuire simply shrugged and frankly admitted that as far as he was personally concerned, he was primarily involved in the transaction as a businessman and was being well taken care of for his efforts. It would be equally profitable for Butler, he hinted, if the general were disposed to cooperate. Butler pumped him about Colonel Murphy's connection with the plan. Murphy, McGuire revealed, was one of the founders of the Legion and had actually underwritten it with $125,000 in 1919 to pay for the organizational field work. He had been motivated by a desire to see the soldiers cared for. That was too much for Butler, who sardonically pointed out that wealthy men had been using the Legion ever since to break strikes. McGuire hastily assured him that Murphy had had nothing to do with that aspect of the organization. When Butler questioned Murphy's motive in wanting the gold standard speech made at the convention, McGuire explained that he and the other backers simply wanted to be sure that the veterans would be paid their bonus in sound gold-backed currency, not in, quote, rubber money. He showed Butler several checks for large amounts signed by Murphy and 2 other men, Robert S. Clark and John Mills. Clark's name rang a bell with Butler. He had known a second lieutenant, Robert S. Clark, in China during the Boxer campaign, and had been called, quote, the millionaire lieutenant, end quote. The money, McGuire said, would be used to open an expense account for Butler in Chicago. He hoped that the general would now get busy rounding up veterans to take to the convention. Butler remained noncommittal. He intended to procrastinate for as long as he could, continuing to pump McGuire until he had enough information to make a complete report to the government. The president, he felt, ought to know what schemes his rich opponents were up to overthrow New Deal policies. After the visit, Butler brooded over the implication of MacArthur's revelation that his employer, key founder and sponsor of the American Legion, was involved. Tall, heavy-set Grayson Mallet Prevost Murphy not only operated one of Wall Street's leading brokerage houses, but was also a director of Guarantee Trust, a Morgan bank, and had extensive industrial and financial interests as the director of Anaconda Copper, Goodyear Tire, and Bethlehem Steel. A West Point graduate, Murphy was a veteran of the Spanish-American War and World War I with the rank of colonel. Butler's bushy eyebrows rose when he also learned that the financier had been decorated by Benito Mussolini, who had made him a commander of the Crown of Italy. Butler found out that he had been one of 20 American officers who had met in Paris in February 1919, reportedly on orders from commanders of the AEF to counter revolutionary unrest in Europe following the end of World War I by forming a veterans organization with the alleged purpose of looking after veterans' welfare and uniting them to defend America at home and as abroad. Murphy had put up $125,000 to get the American Legion going, and it had been organized in the spring with a caucus of about 1,000 officers and men. The Legion had then solicited funds and support from industrialists. Swift and Company executives had written other firms, quote, "We are all interested in the Legion, the results it will obtain, and the ultimate effect in helping to offset radicalism," end quote. The average veteran who joined the Legion in the 1920s had been unaware that big businessmen were backing it to use as a strike-breaking agency. When workers struck against wage cuts, Legion posts were informed that the strikers were communists trying to create national chaos so that the Reds could take over. Legionnaires were given baseball bats to break up strikes and civil rights demonstrations. The American Civil Liberties Union later reported, quote, "Of the forces most active in attacking civil rights, the American Legion led the field." The rank and file, however, had grown increasingly restless and impatient with the royal family that ran the Legion, especially after the Depression had left so many jobless. Veterans forced to sell apples on street corners were angered by Legion leadership that opposed the bonus and government spending as inflationary. That was why so many thousands had bypassed the Legion to join the bonus march on Washington. Adding up the facts, Butler was struck by a startling contradiction. McGuire had claimed to speak for the rank-and-file discontent with the Legion's bosses and professed to want to oust them, yet he was an agent for a top founder of the Legion, who was obviously one of the powers behind the throne. McGuire had revealed that the Legion still owed Murphy part of the $125,000 foundation money he had provided, and had tacitly acknowledged that Murphy, quote, "makes the kings," end quote. McGuire obviously had to be lying in his claim that he, or Murphy, wanted to topple the present leadership. Why? Perhaps it was a ruse to channel and control popular discontent in the Legion, hopefully with Butler's help, for the purposes of the 9 wealthy men behind McGuire. Butler awaited McGuire's next move with deep interest.